Hi, you want the answer to two questions. What is a 504 plan and how can it help my child? Well, I'm here to answer that. Not only give you the definitions and where you can find additional information, but give you some concrete resources and action steps that you can take today that can begin your advocacy and start to rewrite the school experience for your child. As we get going, you're going to want to know a little bit about how I am credible to talk about this. So, my name is Cheryl Agarwal, and I'm an educator. I've been teaching since the last century, and I've had 20 years in school leadership. So, 10 years as a middle school, high school assistant principal, and the middle school principal. So, 10 years at the site, working with families, working with teachers, working with all the daily ins and outs. And then 10 years working with hundreds of other leaders across dozens of school districts from pre-K, elementary, all the way through high school, every different type of setting, working with those leaders at the school site and district, their teachers and coaches on really improving schools for a greater number of students. So it's 2 decades of working with families, working with students, understanding the systems and patterns, and putting that into practice. I still work with educators, and now I'm bringing in families so that I believe that when working on 504 plans and our understanding of how to better support students with ADHD, anxiety, chronic health conditions, and much more, we can transform it for those individual students. And by working in partnership, we can also transform our school system for the better. So let's dive into the actual definitions of what a 504 plan is and what you can do with it. 504 plans come from a federal law. And I want to start before I get in the federal law, which you have the definition here. I want you to understand that if you've heard of this term, it's probably because either your school has suggested it or you already have one in place for your child, but you don't really understand all that you can and cannot do with a 504 plan, or a doctor, a therapist, a friend, someone on the sports team, somebody you've talked to has mentioned your child should have a 504 plan. And I'm going to focus in on examples that really talk about ADHD and anxiety and chronic health issues and how that can show up with anxiety and some more flexible thinking needed. But if you are a parent to a child with a whole variety of possible additional needs in school that are not quite special education, meaning there's not a specialized service, we'll get into that too, 504 plans might be the right fit. They keep, for the most part, students in a general education setting, but they're a plan of federal protections that are implemented at your child's school that help them just have a successful school experience and have the access to the school day. So the law is the 1973 Rehabilitation Act, and Section 504 is where we get the part that is specifically talking about protecting persons from discrimination for a disability. It covers a lot of different areas: housing, health and human services, employment. We're talking about education specifically. So if you look at this definition here on the screen, you can see Section 504 is a federal law that prohibits disability discrimination by recipients of federal financial assistance. Let's just break that one sentence down. If you are a parent of a child who is in a public school system or a charter school that is part of a public school system, they are receiving federal funds. If you are a parent in a private school or independent school, there's more chance that they are not receiving federal funds, and Section 504 might not apply and most likely doesn't. However, I still would recommend you learn about this if your child meet some of these criteria we talk about, so that A, you're more informed about how to work with the school on what type of accommodations you couldn't put in place. You know what questions to ask about if they are. And number 3, you can also just consider all of your school placement options in light of this information. This particular definition comes right from the Department of Education and the Office of Civil Rights. The Office of Civil Rights is the federal entity that kind of supports and monitors, they support and monitor that 504 plans and the disability protections are put in place. But each of the actions, creating it, eligibility, figuring out what it is in your school system, is a local decision. And this is where we get into some of the confusion. So we're going to start with the big, broad definition, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about the questions to ask and understand in your exact context. So Section 504 has a few definitions within it. And one of the definitions is going to explain what a disability is defined as within the regulations. So this is the actual language, again, that is provided in a parent and educator resource guide. And I will provide that to you because it's freely available from the Department of Education. But the gist of it is if your student has a physical or mental impairment, a disability condition that is significantly impacting or substantially limiting a major life function, they're eligible for some federal protections. Now, here's the first thing that where families start to get both overwhelmed, confused, or think that it might not apply to their student. Number one is you might look at your student and think they are not substantially limited. I've never thought about it as a disability. I don't want them labeled or othered. And so you might have backed away from the idea of asking for or pushing for additional support. However, the great news is that we've learned so much about anxiety and ADHD in particular in the last decade, and even in the last 5 or 6 years. And so we know how much this really does impact any individual, whether they are 7 years old or 17 years old. And we know that there are a lot of successful ways we can restructure routines and communication and strategies we can teach and ways the school can reconfigure things that are not only better for your child, but honestly are more modern and better for the whole classroom. So because we have this information and your child doesn't have to unnecessarily navigate each day or going into middle school, navigate 5 or 6 different classrooms and the teachers' rules and routines, or experience a sense of emotional burnout and overwhelm in their mental health, when we could just put some things in place to help improve their own skills and advocacy. So some of this is going to be covered in the mindset part, where I'm going to ask you and invite you as a parent to really think about when I use words like disability or substantially limiting life activity, what comes up for you as a feeling? Is that something that actually rings true when you think about the day-to-day experience of your child? You think about their emotional inner life. You think about the narrative that might be in their head. And you think, if we put some things in place, I could see my child thriving more. And these are terms that are part of the law. They don't necessarily have to be terms that you use in your day-to-day experience. However, they're not problematic, and that's part of the mindset I want to bring to you. So major life activity, this is another piece. So that definition piece of a disability and major life activity are the two big pieces that are in place federally that I'm going to talk to you about how it's implemented at your school district. So major life activity, if you look at this list, you're going to see a whole host of things. You're going to see things that are truly just the nature of life. You've got caring for oneself, you've got breathing, learning. And when I come back to things like ADHD and anxiety, learning is most definitely impacted substantially when students who are really experiencing really impactful levels of ADHD and anxiety, meaning they're navigating and holding so much as they go through each day. And you might have had the good fortune of a teacher that naturally had a lot of skill building and resiliency and social emotional regulation pieces and really well organized and kind. And last year, your child was thriving. And that was probably because it was a very neuro-inclusive space, meaning we know about neurodiversity, the ways in which our brains are created and working has a huge mosaic of possibilities. And neuro-inclusive environments are built to say, I take that into account. And that students with a lot of different ways of walking through the world are going to have some strategies and supports here. So maybe your child was doing really well last year, but this year they're struggling. And that is not on your child entirely. It is on us as a school system, parents and school systems together, to figure out what can we put in place to bring more of the thrive into their day and build their independence. So we'll look at the major life activities, and if learning is majorly impacted by how your child is able to stay and maintain focus, is able to work through a multi-step project, is able to show up and present what they know repeatedly over time in different situations, test, project, group presentations. Many of these different things are substantially limited by the presence of this physical or mental impairment. And so these are the two things that school districts are going to be looking at. I'll tell you a little bit more about, again, how this translates to your exact situation. Okay, so the next place we come to is, what does this actually look like at my child's school? This is where it continues to get quite complicated, because even though there's these federal definitions and there's more in that book about determining eligibility and some suggestions about guidance of teams, the law is in place, but the individual inaction and interpretation of what that law exactly means varies widely. So even within one state, even within one county, you might have school districts who have very different processes. You might have someone who has been the 504 coordinator for years, who has done hundreds of 504 plans and is up to date on all the legal and going to conferences and staying current on what modern accommodations are in research. You might have someone who has been doing it for years and has not stayed up to date and is just repeating practices from 5, 10, 15, 20 years ago and not reflecting updated information or ways that schools can work. You might have someone who has become the 504 coordinator last year and is just gaining an understanding of it, but was not really trained on what 504 plans are and is really just relying on institutional memory or professional groups they can ping for questions. And so what that means is that schools and students have widely varied experiences. So one child who is entering middle school and the family is really seeing that having some accommodations in place are going to help them tremendously, might have easy access and some brilliant suggestions from the team, because that team has stayed current, has really thought robustly about the ways they can be neuro-inclusive in the schools. And the plan is a seamless process. The team comes together, they come up with 2 to 3 wonderful accommodations that they go into place, and that young person starts to thrive. But just 2 schools over, or another district, you could have a very similar situation going into middle school, and that family could be met with, we can give them a planner, or we can check the planner, but really they have to become more independent and develop this skill. And the family is saying, but what we know is that this is a key time for every child when they're learning things called executive functioning. They're learning how to plan. And then we have additional information that my child is navigating the world with ADHD. And so wouldn't you put some things in place to teach them how to keep track of those assignments and change through 5 or 6 or 7 different classrooms a day? 2 students, 2 wildly different experiences, solely because the school systems have different processes for staying current, learning what that might look like in the classroom and implementing it. So you have federal law and you have a federal kind of oversight and protection, but your actual plan in your school can vary wildly. So I'm going to talk mostly to folks who are having a frustrating or delayed experience with your school, and what you can do to start taking action right now, build that partnership, and really advocate for your child. A 504 plan is merely a documented plan that is saying this is the qualifying condition. So the school team has a process to determine eligibility. Almost always a diagnosis will match eligibility, but it doesn't necessarily have to. And this is a part, well, push in on some other resources I have and I work with families on. There can be a perception that a school says, this child's doing well. They're in high school and they've been getting all B's. They've been getting all A's. They don't need an accommodation. And that is not painting the full picture. I'm going to tell you how to advocate, because your child being able to navigate her whole day and maintain all of the energy and focus to do so without accommodations when she could be eligible for them is not a reason to deny the plan. Similarly, a child cannot be denied a 504 plan because they are receiving therapy outside of school or on medication. Those are called mitigating factors. And those mitigating factors are part of why the child is being successful, but they are not to be used to disqualify eligibility. They are part of what is in place and also a part of saying that this is substantially impacting the student's life. A 504 plan, is a document that the school team with the family comes together to define eligibility and comes up with a handful, sometimes one, sometimes three, sometimes more, reasonable accommodations to specifically address the area of greatest need for your child. Now, there's a lot of variation on that, and we'll talk about that when we get into mindsets. Okay, to summarize what we have so far, we have a federal law that is establishing that at the school that there needs to be processes in place to protect students with disabilities from being discriminated against or on not accessing their education. That's really the gist of it, is that the Section 504 plan is saying there's something we know about this child, and we are going to build a plan. We're going to work with the school and student and family, and we are going to help give them a direct path to access to their classes and their curriculum and the school experience to have success. I really lean into the idea of mindset because mindset above all else is very important. You can get into conflict around 504 plans with a school, site, or district when people are very locked into the idea that this is the process, when there's a mindset that someone's trying to take advantage of an accommodation, or when there's a mindset that a student is doing so well it's not needed. So first, as a parent, you really have to ask yourself, do I have any of these mindsets? Do I think my child is trying to get away with something? Do I see it as not that bad? And I want to invite you to flip a few things. I have always operated from the premise that the entire time students are in our school system, so age 3, 4-ish through age 18-ish, they are experiencing massive neurological development, massive emotional development, massive physiological changes, all of which impact who they are, how they form their beliefs about themselves, how they make decisions, how they navigate the world. We know this. This is scientifically proven and established. And then we know it. If you've been around enough youth and teenagers, you know that's happening. There's some predictable stages, and then there's outliers, right? So we know that the entire time they're in the school system, they're developing, they're learning, and then we're launching them out to continue to make decisions and use that information. The executive functioning for any young person isn't really set until their mid-20s. So this idea to plan ahead, evaluate decisions, regulate impulsivity and emotions is something that is definitely under construction while they're in our school system. So if you have the mindset, that's what's happening. And our job as parents and schools is to come at it with that knowledge and support that young person to develop productively and healthily and independently so that as their brain continues to develop and they gain more information and make decisions in the world, they're wise, they're community oriented, and they're confident. So that means starting with a strengths-based response. I have always advocated for this, even when I was encountering working with students who were getting straight F's across the board, whose behavior was argumentative, who were not turning work in. I didn't believe that there's a single young person out there who wants that outcome. They are responding to what the system they are part of and how they know how to navigate it. It's our job to get curious and to think, what are their strengths? How can we build on their strengths, give them more of their strengths while we're teaching them how to do the work of school, the work of being a community member, the work of dealing with authority. These are the 3 biggest behaviors that educators are complaining about that are seen as overwhelming. What if we could get ahead of that for your child and as a result put some things in place that got ahead of it for so many more that would truly rewrite the school experience for so many? So when you know your audience, I talked about where they are in their developmental stage. Working with someone in third grade is different than seventh grade, is different than 10th grade. So know your audience, tailor the way that you're involving them in the process to their age and stage, but include them. Make them the hero of their own story. Let me go back to strengths based for a second. We've been talking about plans, legal jargon, but when you think about your child and if they were in a meeting with the educators from their school, would they feel excited or would they feel a little nervous and scared? Would they hear about their strengths or would they hear one or two sentences about their strengths and then a list of things that aren't happening? You have to think about it from that young person's perspective. If they are not seeing that everyone is looking at their strengths and inviting them in as the hero of their story, then we haven't yet really known our audience. Any 7-year-old who's having frequent disruption at school and not finishing his work and walking around the classroom, he wants to be the hero of his story too. And how can you model as a parent that with them and give the school some ways to approach a 504 plan that make him the hero and teach him how to grow over time into an independent, responsible community member? Okay, it's not going to happen in one meeting. It's not going to happen in 2 meetings, but the goal is to come up with accommodations that teach this young person to grow over time in a developmentally matched way that takes into account what we know about how they experience the world through their neurodiversity. And this mindset is more important than we think. Think about yourself as an adult. If you are in a work conversation or even a community group conversation and you feel that you are affirmed, that you are seen, and you are supported, you probably show up in a way that's completely different than if you feel that you are getting little things always finding fault with you. You're probably going to show up differently. It's no different. In fact, it's very important for young people. They are forming their identity. And when you think about students going up through 5th and 6th grade, if they are continuing to have these types of conversations and interaction with school, they're getting more and more disengaged with school. That's not the goal. We know that it's a time we want to connect with them. We want to build up their own capacity and their ability and their belief in what they're capable of. And we have the knowledge to do that. So let me get into some concrete examples. Okay, now types of support go beyond what I have listed here. 504 and special education actually are overlapping Venn diagram circles. So special education is a whole different area of the way services are provided. And if you have questions about that, why don't you leave a comment or message me and I can answer them and then point you in the direction of someone who is really skilled or some multiple people in that. I speak about the 504 plan. So while I'm very knowledgeable about special education, I talk about that part before it gets to special education or cases where a student's not eligible. Special education has very specific eligibility criteria that is defined for very specific reasons and timelines and specific assessment measures. And you might find that your student with anxiety or ADHD does not qualify for special education. That does not mean they don't get any services. So 504 can be done within the school day, within the general classroom. However, it's not exclusive from special education. So if a team determines that the need is such that there is some more services, say a specialist or a certain classroom environment, something like that, team could decide that. Those are very more unique cases. And again, I can talk to you about that. I'm talking more generally. So the types of support most common in 504 plans are what I have here on the screen. Talking about classroom environment changes. So places we're putting the desk, not just right by the teacher, front row, not by friends, which I see commonly, but actually a strategic choice. Sometimes right by the teacher isn't the best place for that student, but away from the door or next to the window or at this pod and the tables are set up in a certain way. Classroom environment that's very specific. Looking at regulation zones. So thinking about the environment where that student, whether they're a teenager or an elementary school student, what they might do to move about the classroom and regulate their energy, their focus, and their movement. And also it can be other pieces of the classroom environment. They might have wiggle stools or other type of actual things at the desk that help support. It can be productivity and time management. So again, another common one is use a planner, but we'll talk about that at the end with simple ways you can make that actually a skill building piece, visual schedules, different project trackers. So there's some really skillful ways to do this that match what your student needs that could radically transform their experience. Communication. Oftentimes students are communicating either with disruption, that's a form of communication, or they're not communicating. They have a need, they're anxious, they're confused, losing track, and they're masking. They're pretending that they are not having those difficulties because they don't want to get in trouble with the teacher. They don't want the unnecessary attention from the teacher or their peers. And so there are lots of communication tools that build up their skills so that they're able to communicate what's happening for them and what they need in a way that has no shame. And also formatting. So there's ways to change the format of the way textbooks are, or assignments, or tests, or projects. So these are some general supports. There are many more, and there are many that can be customized to your students' need. But these are the types of things that show up in a 504 plan. And the more specific and the more match to date about your child, the better and the more effective. One accommodation I see all the time is extra time on tests. That's a blanket accommodation because the thought is students with anxiety or ADHD might need more time. They might get stuck, they might need to refocus, etc. However, that's just a very generic accommodation. And at the end of a year of having that, this young person has known better strategies to navigate timed tests than they did before. They just had more time. We didn't do anything to empower them, to teach them, and to help them better identify what's even happening for them in a testing situation. So what I work with families on is to say, okay, your child want extra time on tests might help them. Why? It's going to be different for every child. One child might have a hard time knowing which part of the test to start on. The accommodation might be helping them chunk how the test format is set up, especially when they're going across different subject areas. Even in elementary, tests look different with the same teacher. But by the time you get to middle and high school, they're different in every teacher's class. So making an accommodation that's more about the test formatting or the process that the student can use to interact with any test and spending some time getting curious about that. So we've done that with students where they've looked at the open-ended questions versus the recall. They've had different highlighters. They've used colored paper to block out sections. We've also had teachers who gave the test in parts. So a multi-page test, maybe they get one page at a time. They can just bring their focus to that, reduce any sense of overwhelm, and navigate it that way. These are all very different and specific ways of giving a student extra time. But it has to be partnered with talking to that student and doing some debrief about what happened in that test, what felt really good, what felt a little overwhelming, getting curious and looking at how their results were, looking for patterns, applying our knowledge, and giving them another strategy for next time. It might be what worked really was when we gave you the test one page at a time. Let's try that again. What do you think? The student says yes. The student says no. The student might let you know, actually, that was fine, but what really worked is that there's a person who sits 2 rows up that normally taps their foot all the time, and it really distracts me, and he wasn't in class today. So you have to talk to the young person to see, is the accommodation we're putting in place what's working? So that's one way, just very simple, extra time on tests. You got to know why a student needs extra time. Another student might have extra time on tests, but it's not about getting started. It's not even about the chunking. It's about some emotional regulation that needs to happen. Anxiety might show up really extreme, or they might have a chronic health condition. They might have diabetes and need to monitor their blood sugar. So you can come up with all sorts of different ways that match that. In the case of the regulation, you might spend time thinking the night before, the morning before, the 5 minutes before, just some grounding routines for that student so they can bring their own anxiety down and access the test. You're giving them a strategy they can use this year, next year, all the way in through their adult life, instead of just extra time on tests, which didn't teach them anything about how to successfully understand, implement, and support their emotional regulation. So that's for one accommodation, extra time. And if you want to stick around, I'll tell you about one more. Okay, here's the last one for today. So I was choosing between planner and frequent movement breaks. So I'm going to go with frequent movement breaks, but I have a good one for a planner too. So frequent movement breaks is, again, frequently put in accommodation plans, and it's as general as that. It can get up for movement break as needed. And the problem I see with that is that two things. For younger students in elementary, they might have it, but they're not wisely connecting when I need a break with what's happening in my body or mind, because it's not paired with some of the simple tools we have to have a rating scale, to have a picture scale, to proactively take a movement break, maybe half an hour after snack, half an hour before lunch, 20 minutes after coming in from recess, etc., to do the right type of movement for the energy that child has at the day. Not all movement is equal. Getting up and just going to sharpen the pencil is different than getting up and doing 5 stretches around the divider in the classroom, is different than taking a loop around the outside courtyard, is different than helping do a classroom activity, right? And you don't know which set of movement breaks are right for a student until you really pay attention to what's happening in the course of a day, into teaching the child how to have some language to name what's happening in his or her body or their mind, and giving them more and more information that they can share back out with you. That's a strategy. That's a movement break. And when we get into middle and high school and even some upper elementary, movement breaks being really strategic and really matched to the student are incredibly important because they also start to really calculate the social factor. They don't want to get up from the desk in certain cases because they're aware of what they think others might be perceiving. Another kid might not be paying any attention, but we know this about adolescence, is that it be socialization and peers and not drawing extra attention to oneself become extra important. So again, matching the movement break to the young person. You might also have someone in middle school who having a movement break that is more active and that is intentionally outside of the classroom is going to give them the release they need without them becoming the performer for the class because it's early afternoon and that's when their energy seems to just need to have some bursts, right? So you can look at things like movement breaks that a school is suggesting and say, I would really like to get more curious about what my child needs in her day, his day, their day. And I would like to have the accommodation be teaching them some skills. And so we can look at how effective a strategy that is. My goal is that this plan has them have a successful year right now, but is also giving them skills and strategies they can use for the years to come. Okay, you've been with me. You've been with me here for a while, and I've been talking about the law, the variation from school to school, and why you might be experiencing something very different than your cousin in another state or even in another city. We've been talking about the mindset, the critical way that if you want this, any accommodation plan to work for your child, it has to come from strength based and thinking about where they are developing over time. So lastly, I'm going to give you 2 examples of what I'm talking about, how easy this is to make some changes within a classroom and the ways that you can talk with the school. And I work with folks to give scripts and customized plans so that you can make it really match your student. But these are two concrete examples. So let me tell you one. One example I see all the time is extra time on tests. That's a blanket accommodation because the thought is students with anxiety or ADHD might need more time. They might get stuck, they might need to refocus, etc. However, that's just a very generic accommodation. And at the end of a year of having that, this young person has known better strategies to navigate timed tests than they did before. They just had more time. We didn't do anything to empower them, to teach them, and to help them better identify what's even happening for them in a testing situation. So what I work with families on is to say, okay, your child want extra time on tests might help them. Why? It's going to be different for every child. One child might have a hard time knowing which part of the test to start on. The accommodation might be helping them chunk how the test format is set up, especially when they're going across different subject areas. Even in elementary, tests look different with the same teacher. But by the time you get to middle and high school, they're different in every teacher's class. So making an accommodation that's more about the test formatting or the process that the student can use to interact with any test, and spending some time getting curious about that. So we've done that with students where they've looked at the open-ended questions versus the recall. They've had different highlighters. They've used colored paper to block out sections. We've also had teachers who gave the test in parts. So a multi-page test, maybe they get one page at a time. They can just bring their focus to that, reduce any sense of overwhelm, and navigate it that way. These are all very different and specific ways of giving a student extra time. But it has to be partnered with talking to that student and doing some debrief about what happened in that test, what felt really good, what felt a little overwhelming, getting curious and looking at how their results were, looking for patterns, applying our knowledge, and giving them another strategy for next time. It might be what worked really was when we gave you the test one page at a time. Let's try that again. What do you think? The student says yes. The student says no. The student might let you know, actually, that was fine, but what really worked is that there's a person who sits 2 rows up that normally taps their foot all the time, and it really distracts me, and he wasn't in class today. So you have to talk to the young person to see, is the accommodation we're putting in place what's working? So that's one way, just very simple, extra time on tests. You got to know why a student needs extra time. Another student might have extra time on tests, but it's not about getting started. It's not even about the chunking. It's about some emotional regulation that needs to happen. Anxiety might show up really extreme, or they might have a chronic health condition. They might have diabetes and need to monitor their blood sugar. So you can come up with all sorts of different ways that match that. In the case of the regulation, you might spend time thinking the night before, the morning before, the 5 minutes before, just some grounding routines for that student so they can bring their own anxiety down and access the test. You're giving them a strategy they can use this year, next year, all the way in through their adult life, instead of just extra time on tests, which didn't teach them anything about how to successfully understand, implement, and support their emotional regulation. So that's for one accommodation and extra time. And if you want to stick around, I'll tell you about one more. Okay, so we went through a lot today, and I'm sure that you have more questions. And I love working with families on creating plans for their child. I believe that we can put things in place right away to turn it around. So if you want to continue the conversation directly, my email is there, cheryl@pulsehive.com. You can also find about my services and ways I can work with you right away, pulsehive.com. And if you just want to stay connected, sign up for my newsletter or follow me on Instagram or here on YouTube at Educators Evolving. So I would love to stay connected. I'll share with you the resources from the Department of Education and Office of Civil Rights, as well as some of these content pieces that I've put together for the families I'm working and educators I'm working with. Because one thing I know is that the best accommodation for everyone is the one that works. And I'd like to get you there.